Get this thing recorded. So we're gonna do a little bit of an exercise here. I haven't released these slides yet, but I'm gonna work with you all on this. So we're talking about the racism and anti-Asian movements. Okay, so that's a lot to sort of unpack here. But I wanted us to think about racism and how it is a social construct, right? Now, I know we have a few sociologists in here, some sociologists. Anyone in the room? Sociologists? No? So I know, or maybe someone must have taken sociology classes. But I think it's just important for us to sort of unpack what the social construct means, right? So a race is a social construct. It's man-made, right? It's made by society. And I think it's really important that we sort of unpack these situations because I think it's important for us to understand that it's important for us to understand how race is not something that is inherently built into us, right? And I'm hoping that we understand that, right? And that's going to make our lives a little bit easier when we're discussing how, the economic discrimination, the legal disenfranchisement, violence, ridicule, and the segregation that was essentially happening against Asians, right, as a result of that, right? So it wasn't like, we might hear that certain groups are inferior than other groups, right? Or some groups are better than other groups, right? Well, that is all a social construct. So we're talking about how Asians were targeted, right? We're also talking about how this is also made by like society and those who are in power, right? So, and this was actually sort of framed within the legal system. We're talking about legal disenfranchisement of Asians in America, right? And so we're talking about pre-Chinese exclusion, right? And these acts, though, were essentially like, leading up to what we see with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. You also had the Naturalization Act of 1790, which preserved the right of naturalization for anyone that is a free white person, right? But then we also had, the courts that were also corrupt, and other non-white and Chinese were sort of discriminated, right, against being able to become naturalized citizens, right? This was happening back in the 1790s. And another example that we see with this was the People versus Hall, which is a really sort of eye-opening case where a white man murdered a Chinese man, and yet the courts didn't allow for this test for sort of whites and Chinese to sort of testify against the white man who murdered the Chinese person, right? And so what we see is this sort of notion of othering and sort of viewing the Chinese and viewing sort of Asians as sort of not having, right, these sort of fundamental rights, right? And this was sort of implemented in the sort of the legal, right, not only discourse, right, but political sort of rhetoric, et cetera, but it's actually part of like the fabric of society. Right? And so this all led up to what we see as the Chinese Exclusion Act, which explicitly denies the right for naturalization, right, for citizenship for the Chinese. Right? So that's completely blatantly excluding, right, Chinese. Now, this is sort of unclear for other, right, sort of groups. And so there are these sort of agreements that were kind of taking place where maybe Japanese could become citizens. And there are these sort of this legal battles that were happening in terms of like allowing certain folks to then be able to have sort of Chinese American citizenship, right? That was like the ultimate goal, right? And yet you saw Asian Indians were considered somewhat Asian or somewhat white, right? But not white enough to then be declared as citizens. You had, right? And so this kind of reframes and allows us to sort of think in terms of how race is a social construct, right? When we're thinking about how all of these things that were happening, well, why were the Chinese not allowed to have citizenship, but then maybe certain folks were allowed to, et cetera, or possibly, right? And yet you have these cases like Ozawa, who's a Japanese citizen, right, versus the U.S., where he argued that Japanese should be eligible for citizenship, but it was also denied, right? And so you have these sort of monumental court cases that sort of argue for sort of inclusion into the fabric of America, especially with being allowed to have citizenship. But in reality, they were, most, if not all, were denied citizenship, which is a fundamental right that a lot of folks sort of argued for during this time. Okay. So, they were also created as sort of social pariahs. You know what a pariah is? Pariah, like an outcast, right? So they're ostracized, right, of their dignity through physical segregation, miscegenation laws. You know what miscegenation laws are? When we talked a little bit about that earlier in the previous unit, right, where you're not allowed to sort of interracially marry, kind of. And you also had these sort of blatant acts of harassment, right? Xenophobia happened. Okay. Sorry, everything's kind of out there all at once, but just bear with me. I think it's just the setting on my slides, where there's a dislike of or prejudice of people from other countries or anything foreign, like xenophobia, right? And we see a lot of this sort of xenophobia happening today, or at least, in sort of the greater sort of political spectrum too. So this isn't something that is sort of had gone away. Rather, maybe it's been sort of highlighted with COVID, right? As we've seen with this fear of the virus, right? But what then we see is, the sort of creation of these Chinatowns, right? These Chinese or Asian, sort of settlements, right? But yet, when you moved outside of your settlement or outside of your little segregated sort of neighborhood, right, that was considered sort of evil or sort of, causing some sort of panic, right? And as we'll see, that was the case with the Harada House in Riverside, which I'll have another supplemental lecture on next week. That will sort of discuss the types of sort of racial panics that we see. But essentially, you had this sort of reinforcement of racial segregation, even though it was sort of deemed as sort of as something that shouldn't be happening. It was definitely happening regardless, right? Interracial mingling, right, was a big threat. And you'll see this sort of in these sort of historical sort of narratives, even with the Japanese American community, where you had these interactions with like white folks, right? But you were never allowed to sort of cross that boundary of like dating someone that was white. That was completely forbidden. It kind of it was definitely not the social norm, at least, and wasn't normalized like we see today. So it was obviously, a threat to the racial order, right? By having sort of interracial mingling. And it was, and it was definitely sensationalized. We were talking about the taxi dance halls from last unit, right? So the Filipinos, right, they engaged in this behavior, and yet that was seen as being some sort of sensationalized concern that was happening. Okay. And so it definitely, played on the, a stereotype of Asian men sort of chasing white women, right? Trying to sort of steal the, white women away from the white man, kind of a thing. And if that sounds at all familiar, right? This happened obviously with Blacks and the Latinx folks too as well. So it was a very similar thing of othering and sort of separating by creating or manifesting an Asian sort of threat, especially with men, right? And you see this in media with like sort of the emasculation of the Asian man that we even see today. White natives, so there was this portrayal of Asian men as being hyper fertile, right? Immoral habits. And then you also saw this sort of exclusion that was happening with sort of the Chinese folks in San Francisco trying to sort of enroll their children, right, in white schools, right, as we've seen in previous iterations of this happening, right? So sort of saying, no, you have to, sending sort of your child, right, to an Asian school, essentially, right, in an Asian neighborhood was allowed, right? So you see this sort of segregation that was happening even in sort of California, right, against sort of these Asians. So, right, so we see this sort of second-class status sort of come to fruition. And then we also have this economic exclusion that was happening. So Asians were blamed for white unemployment because of their cheap labor. That sounds at all familiar, right? This is happening even today, right? And in terms of like, oh, they're going to be able to sort of, come in, and the people that sort of own the farms, own these sort of businesses, can hire Asian labor for the cheap, right? Because they're less expensive, right? But we also have to realize that they were kind of relegated to low-paying jobs, right? It's not like it was their choice that they were sort of this lesser labor, right? So like during this time, we have like the gold rush that's happening, and the Chinese were sort of looked at as sort of unwelcome, right? Even though they were part of the part of this newcomer class that was coming. It wasn't just them that were new, right? And folks coming in from the East, from Europe, et cetera, trying to mine for gold, and yet they were sort of deemed as like the big pariah problem, right? They were trying to make them a pariah or outcast. So you had economic boycotts of companies, right? Hiring Chinese workers and Japanese-owned businesses were boycotted. And you had to sort of pay, for protection from the police, right? Because of this inherent sort of racism that was happening to either your businesses, whether it was like physical damage to your businesses and elsewhere. And there were these proscriptions of buying land, right? You weren't allowed to sort of buy land, because that was another issue, right? That we'll see with the alien land law. Yeah. Okay.
But they were always specifically branded as Chinese.
Okay.
And I didn't understand like what it was exactly, but it was essentially like teaching me how to be Chinese from like even just behavior, like language of course, but also just like behavior and like some bit of history. And this is obviously when I was a child, and it was like 2 years ago during COVID. I was like a community post where the sad same Chinese school was. I just saw like a lot of hate from a lot of like older white people. So like, why is Chinese school still here? We can try to get rid of it.
Interesting.
But I don't know if that's the Chinese school.
Well, I think this is, well, yes. So there are like, and I grew up in a similar environment. So I guess for those of you who can hear, right, the question, or I guess the comment was that, there are these Chinese schools that you were sent to, right, essentially, and that they were sort of to help you learn Chinese customs. And recently you found out that these Chinese schools were you were trying to get rid of there was a community or some group that was trying to get rid of this school, right? And where was this located? Just like curious. Rowland Heights. Okay. And so when you're thinking about this, I think it's important that the segregation that was happening during that time was like regular school. Like you're talking like, like regular elementary schools, right? Not necessarily like a Chinese language school or a Japanese language school. Because I went to these as a kid growing up, even though they're on the East Coast, but there's a lot here in Southern California. But in that sort of sense, I think there's a little bit of a difference, although
I was wondering if it's like the adjusted version of the previous list. So the ones that I went to, they weren't like they were just like people that are regular public elementary school.
Interesting.
Like all the classes would just like I don't know where they came from, but it's like Chinese teachers all the time. And like it would normally be like as like the regular.
Yeah, and this is what would happen because I think it was just a rented space, right? The elementary school was a rented space, and I think it was, I think those are sort of important culturally to sort of help with sort of the Chinese Americans, right, children or Asian American children to like learn about their customs and their language and stuff. And that's why they sort of take place like after school. Now, I'm not familiar with why there was such pushback, especially in an area like Rolling Heights, right? But I find that when you're talking about this segregation that was happening in like the 1800s, this was like something that was very much specific to what we would see reflected in even like the Jim Crow South, right? So separate but equal kind of thing, where it's like, no, we're going to have these Chinese folks living in this community, but they can't possibly go to school with our other white children, right? And that's where I think you see that it's kind of hugely sort of problematic. That's problematic, right? You're obviously giving, definitely sort of an unequal sort of right treatment to certain folks, right? But I think it's an interesting insight that that there is still such resistance to having like an educational program, right? And yeah. But going back to the sort of economic exclusion, right? So buying land and sort of seeing how, right, there was this exclusionary process that was happening that was very formalized. Right, and so the anti-Asian individuals and groups, they were resorted to violence. And this is kind of interesting what happened with the Chico massacre of 1877. Where there was sort of these Chinese men who were sleeping, were kind of, victims of like this sort of open sort of fire and thrown oil on their bodies and were set on fire, etc. And so this is kind of like a big sort of example of what that violence really sort of manifested into. Like this isn't like super like the passive aggressive microaggressions or violence that we would kind of even see today. And maybe we do see some of that, right, with the sort of elderly folks that are being sort of, accosted in Northern California, et cetera. But, this is like sort of this hyper sort of build up to this sort of extreme racial violence that was happening. So it was definitely something of a reality, right? And so I think it's really important for us to sort of, imagine, right, if we're Asian or if you're someone that walking down the street and having that inherent sort of fear in the back of your mind, right? This was a reality for most folks in the late 1800s, early 1900s, right? Especially in like areas that had heavy populations in San Francisco, right? Growing populations like in Southern California, et cetera. Okay, and so lastly, we have this violence happening, and then we have the closing of the gates, right? So we have this quote unquote Asiatic invasion, right? This isn't something that obviously the Asian folks thought of, right? This is something that was thought of as by the folks that were in power, right? And so this is where the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, right? I don't know, one of my students, is I'm sure doing a project on this as we speak, and we're denied the rights of naturalization for Chinese, and the Geary Act, right, extended it for another 10 years. So even though you had this sort of anti-Chinese Exclusion Act, you then had this sort of extension for another 10 years, right? And this is the first time, and I highlighted this, the first time federal law prescribed entry of an ethnic working group on the premise that it endangered the good order of certain localities. So this is the first sort of iteration of we see like these anti-immigration type of policy that's sort of woven into the legal, right? The law, essentially, right, was the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? So this sets that precedence, right? And I think it's really important for us to understand that when we see immigration law in this sort of contemporary sense, right, this is kind of like ground zero. This is kind of where it all started. So then you had these sort of different sort of policies on how you would enter into the United States, whether or not you had to sort of formulate a sort of a reason to enter, right? So you had maybe restricted, right? There were these restricted borders, right? And it also was I think this last point here, or this bottom point here, it validated racism, right, in policymaking, and led to future iterations against other Asian groups like the Japanese. Okay, so this kind of set the foundation of saying, well, we're allowed to do this. We're allowed to sort of exclude. Like this is pretty, from the position of power. This is something that is really good. Okay. And then what you have is these sort of anti-immigration Japanese bills, right? You have the Gentleman's Agreement, right? Which is another bill that kind of played off of this, right? Where it can then prevent Japanese folks from coming in the United States, right? Okay. And so this is where, you know, you see some sort of rift, a little bit of a rift that's happening between sort of international powers. Okay, so Japan's establishing itself as an imperial power at this time. And as you can see, the reason why it was a gentleman's agreement, right, is because it was never like formalized. It was never like put on paper saying, oh, you know what, we're going to actually make a formal act about this because, right, there's this sort of international sort of, right, foreign relations that's happening that the United States wanted to sort of cultivate, especially during, you know, this sort of build up to like World War I, right? You have this sort of growing superpower, and the United States is also kind of in this sort of transitionary period of like growing itself economically, politically on the international stage. So they were both kind of working together, but yet there was still this huge problem of, well, quote unquote problem of like Japanese immigrants and how it became politicized but on the state level, and having a lot of like anti sort of Japanese anti-Asian movement that was happening right during this time. So you had people that were either being violently persecuted, right? You had folks that were saying, you know, they're taking our jobs, they're a huge problem, they're a menace to society, etc. And so this is why both sort of countries came together and became this sort of handshake agreement that sort of tapered immigration because of this sort of problem, right? There are these bachelor societies that all they're doing is gambling, doing drugs, drinking, prostitution, etc. Right? They don't belong here, right? They don't fall into this Christian sort of mold of this Leave It to Beaver nuclear family, right? But this is why this sort of these agreements sort of happen. Okay. And then you also had, you know, the South Asians and Indians had to deal with similar denials of immigration, right? And again, it just plays off of this sort of similar anti-Asian racist sort of policy rhetoric, and this is coming from, you know, the ground up, you know, from folks that feel this way, and obviously when you're a politician, you're going to play into that sort of as a way to sort of catapult your own political career. So. And then so like when you do like archival work, or if you look into this for your projects, for example, you'll definitely see that, you know, political campaigns were built around anti-Japanese movement, right? And nativist movements, right? So. And last, I won't bore you too much today, but this last slide, right? A greater good, right? Mobilizing the marginalized. So anti-Asian leaders linked Asian immigrants to corporate power, right? Public health, racial purity, right? And other concerns, right? They were sort of messing up the racial hierarchy, the order, right? They as in the Asians, right? And so you see a lot of, you know, these sort of movements, right? And we're talking about mobilizing, you know, in terms of like, you know, sort of this sort of white supremacist anti-Asian mobilization that was really happening, okay? So you see how there's historians, you know, that have described how there's anti-Chinese, but also anti-Black politics, and it's all kind of conglomerating too. And it's fun. It's really interesting to sort of delve into sort of that political rhetoric. What do you do with this Chinese problem? What do you do with this Asian problem? And so you saw a lot of folks, well, are they Black, right? Or are they like Native American, right? Are they, you know, because I think even there's like one like argument saying that there's like, that Native Americans, right, came from the Bering Sea, so technically they're Asian. So maybe we should treat them and put them in their own sort of, reservation, right? Kind of what they did with the Native Americans, right? So there's like all this like political discourse that's happening to sort of fix the quote unquote Asian problem, right? And as we'll see in the coming units, we'll definitely find out more about how that gets sort of mobilizing further with Japanese incarceration, right, as being sort of a big sort of moment in sort of this pinnacle sort of moment of anti-Asian, anti-Japanese in particular sort of movement that happens within the United States. Okay, cool. All right. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah, this everything will be uploaded. Yeah. So let me stop the recording.